Yeah, so it's great to be here. I mean, first, I really want to thank Clondalkin Drug and Alcohol Task Force for asking me to speak. Reclaiming community development, like it almost makes me emotional to be given an opportunity to stand up here and talk for 20 minutes about community development, which might be a bit sad or mad, but anyway, it does. Yeah, and that's really what my presentation is about as well. It's about reclaiming community development. Now, obviously, there's an official title on it, which you can see there, which doesn't sound half as interesting. Community participation in the National Drug Strategy, the past, the present, and the future. Yeah, and I think it's important, I got the buttons right. I think it's very important when we're talking about the National Drug Strategy, because again, you know, with strategies, a lot of the time, I know when people hear the word strategy, they kind of want to switch off because they think it sort of documents and, you know, actions and all that. And I think it's really important to start off to say that the overall kind of framework we have now for our national drug strategy with the task forces, it came from the community, it came from community campaigns. And I suppose in a nutshell, you could say what we're about today is it's ours and we need to reclaim it. And I think it's important that we start that at the beginning. You can see there that's marching down on Collins Street past Burger King. Wrong button. Okay, so the beginning, just very quickly, where our current structures of the strategy, our current strategy did come from. And a lot of you here are part of this history and so are very familiar with it. When I say you're part of history, I don't mean to imply that you're old or past it or anything, just to be careful. Yeah, so the 1980s, again, there are a few people here who remember the 1980s. Sometimes I'm talking to groups now as students and realise they weren't even born, but some of you were. So yeah, people will remember initially at the very early 80s when the heroin problem was developing in Dublin, late 70s, early 80s, there were community leaders at that stage, particularly the north and south inner city, were saying we're seeing this problem, it's really affecting our young people and it's taken hold very fast, and they were concerned about it, but they weren't listened to. There was no response from the authorities, from the state, from the services. So as always happens, I suppose, in communities, our communities, when there is no response to what people can clearly see in their own areas is a really serious problem, the community takes its own action. And during the 80s, I suppose that there was two different types of action. People will remember the Concerned Parents Against Drugs. And again, obviously now we look back on that and people see that as something that was very divisive in communities and kind of naive. But we need to remember at that stage you're looking at communities where nobody knew anything about heroin. They didn't know anything about drugs. They didn't know how to deal with it. And there was a logic to saying, let's stop the supply and we'll solve the problem. So obviously now we know that didn't work. But as well, it's important to remember too, and I think Dermot is still here from Ballymun, from Yap, there were also people in local communities actually starting to set up services that far back in the 1980s because of their concern of what was happening, particularly to their young people who were getting sick, in some cases dying, and the lack of a response to it. And then I suppose the key thing at that stage, the community, the protest in the community, it was very focused in the community. It was like, we're going to sort of deal with this problem ourselves. It was kind of looking in on ourselves in a way. In the 1990s then, the voices basically, it started. I mean, there were community leaders from across the city, and unfortunately that's because the problem had spread by this stage across the city to areas like Clondalkin, right across the city. So again, we saw the same kind of community action that on the one hand, people did get involved in setting up services, often just getting a room, finding a doctor, just opening the door and saying we need to do something. And also the street campaign did start again. Which again was about protest and about some stuff again, which similar to Concerned Parents around the availability of drugs. But I suppose an interesting thing is that a number of the community leaders who were involved in the 90s, they looked at this and they said, look, we've done all this in the 1980s. We did all this 10 years ago and we're back to square one. So we need to look at things differently. And that's where the whole idea of focusing on the people with the real power, the politicians, the policy makers, the people who allocate the resources, that they're the people you need to focus your protest on and not keep it local. And that's I suppose, where Citywide came from originally. And then we have this moment of crisis in 1996. Just there, a couple of pictures from, this was the kind of protest and stuff that was going on at the time. Whoops, back to that one. I'm not the greatest at these. I wanted to go back to the one with the women in it. Because again, the role of women, people will remember this in local areas where people set up these kind of patrols to protect their communities, and women played a very key part in that. Again, this is this was referred to, somebody referred to Veronica, I think it was Joe referred to Veronica Guerin earlier. She was at a citywide meeting, and obviously that's, as Joe said, it was, part of what I suppose made this a big political priority at the time was the fact that she was killed. So I think from the importance of the history is that all of that is really, because people sometimes say, well, why do you always talk about the history? That is really important, because that story we've just talked about is really what has shaped what is still the overall framework for our national drug strategy. Because as was said in 1996, Pat Rabbitt's report, it set up the structures we have now, the local drug task forces. And I think it's really, really important to say this when we go to, these are the 4 kind of key principles around the National Drug Strategy at the time, 1996, but it's really, really important to say, if we go down to these principles, these are community development. I mean, look what they say, locally based to meet local needs. Like, there wasn't a government decision where we'll come up with a national plan and we'll tell you all what to do. They said, no, this is a problem in your areas. You're the ones who know it best, so you should come up with your local response. That's community development. Community-led. There was a recognition, and the government minister said at the time, they said, people in your communities were warning us about this problem for years, and we did not listen. So they said, in future, that should never happen again. Pause while I have to cough on that one. Never happen again. So we should have community representation on all our structures as of right. Partnership interagency working, again, the idea that all of the agencies need to work together based on the needs of the community. And then, and the 4th one is really crucial, the local linked national, because as we all know, that's a key part of community development. It isn't just about what you do in your own area, it's about having an influence on the policies, on the decision making, on how resources are allocated. That's what community development is also about. So those key principles of the National Drug Strategy, in fact, are community development principles. And what they meant in practice, again, a lot of you will be very familiar with this, like, it's all very well you have these principles. What do they mean in practice? So we see, for example, with the locally based to meet local need, there was a very clear recognition at the time of area-based disadvantage and structural inequality. That was very clearly recognised in Pat Rabbitt's report. And that led to, and that had real implications for policy, because it led to the setting up of parallel programs. So the RAPID program, as it started, was intended to be a major investment program in communities, because again, the minister at the time, it was Owen Ryan, launched that, and he was saying, look, we have to tackle the root causes of this, and without major investment in your communities, we're not going to do that. So RAPID was set up to do that. And the Young People's Facilities Fund, people remember, was set up as a core part of the drug strategy, because it was about, young people, and how do we make sure that, that they have a different future. So that these kind of broader programs were also seen as very much part of the drug strategy. And again, crucially, there was a mandate. The mandate was given. It wasn't just about, we think you should do plans. People were given a mandate, and then the plans were resourced, and that's something that we'll come back to. I mean, it's crucial. Why would you ask people to do plans if they're not going to be resourced? On the second principle of community-led, and this is really interesting. Like, there was a real understanding of community development in that 1996 document, because I don't know if people remember, there was actually a full page given to a Combat Poverty Agency quote. It got a whole page to itself about community development, and then in recognition of the fact that we hadn't, that community voices hadn't been listened to, there was formal community representation on the task force structures. But not only that, there was a commitment to supporting community networks, because again, it was recognised, look, it's all very well to put community reps on structures, but they've got to have a structure behind them that can support them, so that they can link back into their communities and be supported in what they're doing. Again, in partnership interagency working. And these things are still key today. The Department of the Taoiseach's role was crucial, because they had clout and they could tell the agencies what to do. It wasn't a case of, if you'd like to engage in this, we'd be very happy. It was about, you do this. This is government policy. So there was a built-in obligation for agencies and departments to participate. They had to. And on the national committees, it was part of people's job to be there. And again, it's really, really important that like the National Drug Strategy team, because we have loads of interagency structures and people are on loads of them. The difference about this was it's a structure that was set up for collective decision-making and accountability. Those two words, decision-making and accountability. So agencies didn't come in to say, well, this is what we do. They came in to participate in a discussion where they said, okay, this is what we're thinking of doing. What does everyone else think? How can we work together? How can we? That's collective decision making where you reach agreement together. And collective accountability. So whatever agency or whatever sector you're from, you have to come to the table and say, this is what I did about whatever the issue is. And you have to say it to everyone around the table and you have to hold each other to account. They are key principles. And then finally, on the local link to the national, again around the National Drug Strategy team, people will remember there was membership, there was every local drug task force, regional drug task force had a member of the national team on their task force. So you had that kind of two-way engagement, so it wasn't just kind of a top-down, it was very much two-way relationship, which was key. And then as well, there was an advisory body, which again, in the early days, had a really active relationship with local communities. And when it did research, it went out and it had seminars so that people could hear about the outcomes of the research and see how they might apply them. So that was all the happy part of the story. Did you enjoy that? That's the hat, sorry. No, don't be cynical. The day in the sun, yeah, I had this, you all know from pilot projects, when something is a really important issue, you get a pilot project. And when you have the pilot, like there's a lot of flexibility and you're kind of allowed, break the rules a little bit and you get a bit of extra money and all that. But then we all know that experience when the pilot comes to an end and it becomes mainstreamed, all of a sudden, the things you could do when it was a pilot, you can't do that anymore. Now it has to fit in the box. And in a way, like the day in the sun thing, I think we had, and again, I think it is really important. I know people say, God, but just shut up about years ago. But it is important to talk about the way this strategy did work for 2 or 3 years, because that gives us the right to say, we know that that can work. So people can say to us, oh, we couldn't do that. Yes, you can do it when the political will is there. But again, as we see, that sort of period, day in the sun, it only lasts really while there's a political momentum behind an issue. A huge amount was achieved, and again, it's really important to say that. There were over 400 projects set up. So if people say to us, well, why do you think this was such an effective response? We say, well, look what's there on the ground now. So many of the projects that are here on the ground came from that. But by 2002, you could see very clearly the drugs issue was gone off the agenda. Actually, I remember Bertie Ahern, who was Taoiseach at the time and obviously represented a constituency with a really serious drug problem, and he was being interviewed, I think it was Pat Kenny's show, and he was asked about the drugs issue, and his reply was, oh yeah, no, we've sorted that. We don't have any problem with drug dealing in my constituency anymore. And it wasn't an issue on anybody's manifesto, whereas the previous election it had been. So we could see then this, and this is a quote actually from September 2003 from a citywide seminar about, and somebody referred to this earlier, I think it was Brian referred to the sense of communities feeling tired and feeling shafted and feeling disempowered. So that's 2003. And again, this idea, like with the pilot, you're gradually moving from kind of those exceptions that were allowed in a time of crisis back to the normal way of doing business. And the abolition then of the National Drug Strategy team in 2009, that was a really key moment, because that was like saying that's the end now of that collective decision-making and accountability. And that was really, and I suppose again it's key because there was a point made earlier about, in the end, I think it was Joe made the point about what power do we actually have, and that was, I suppose, a wake-up call in a sense that the community sector, I think all of the NGOs, the task forces, the voluntary sector, community sector, all strongly opposed the abolition of the NEST, and we didn't have the power to stop it because it happened, because a decision had been made at a higher level. Just to cheer you up, we were still marching, it's O'Connell Street again, I think, isn't it? Obviously had this thing about O'Connell Street, so obviously, kind of protest was happening as a response to these changes. So very quickly, I mean, people know what happened to RAPID. It moved from being this very large, major investment programme to just what it is now, which is just a tiny programme. The Young People's Facilities Fund was removed from the drug strategy and basically operated as a separate separate issue. I think that the drug use is across the country and affects all walks of life. This is really key, because of course that's true. Of course it is. We all know that. We all know like things have changed significantly since 1996, when the whole focus was a heroin problem in Dublin. We know that across the country in all walks of life there is really serious problems that needs to be addressed. But that doesn't contradict the next point, which is that the link between problematic drug use and its impact and disadvantage is still as real as ever, and the evidence shows the two things don't contradict each other. It just means you allow for them both. Yes, you have to look at services for everybody, whatever their circumstances, but you still need to address the particular kind of problems that you have in the most disadvantaged areas. They're not contradiction, and they're presented as, oh, well, we can't do the focus on disadvantage because everybody has to be looked after, and that's wrong. They're not a contradiction. You can do both. And then, yeah, as a result, I mean, the local area plans and a lot of the task forces are doing them like you're doing here in Clondalkin. But there isn't a formal mandate now coming from, which is something that should happen now. We have a new strategy. There should be a formal mandate now from the department, from government to task forces to say, some people have their plans done, some are working on it, but to say these plans we're officially mandating you. And then there has to be resources. You know, it's a very simple point, but there has to be resources. And at the moment there are no... There's another protest. We moved from O'Connell Street, I think that was Stephen's Green, gone very posh, went over to Stephen's Green to yeah, again, some of this has been referred to earlier as well. Again, as you see, the whole community development approach being kind of undermined, and this was talked about, the change from the community development programme to CCAP. And again, there's some quotes there that you can see, and that's from some community reps research that was done in 2017, 2016. And they're the kind of quotes, yeah. People talk there about the cuts in support for community development and community networks and the impact that it's had, which again, obviously you're all very familiar with. There's no real need to tell you about that. And again, and I'll come back to this next point later on about the competition and division, and we know that cutbacks did have that effect of causing division in communities, and particularly when you look at the role of the community rep in the community projects, because community reps found themselves in the middle of this on their task forces, having a role in cutting local projects, which is not something they'd ever envisaged being part of, and it obviously create huge difficulties for people. And again, this final point, which I think it's often underestimated or not spoken about enough when we talk about community development today, is the impact of intimidation is massive. I mean, we hear about the high level stuff, we hear about the violence, but you all know about the day to day, day after day after day, the kind of low level intimidation that's going on. That really, I mean, it drains people of their will to get involved, and it does, the reality is, it does stop people because they feel, I just want to keep my head down, I don't want to see what's going on, I don't want anyone to see me getting involved, I don't want to go to meetings around drugs because people will think, I think the impact of that is really underestimated, and the impact on the things that make our community strong, like the solidarity and the resilience, it has a real impact on those things, and it's not often acknowledged. Again, another campaign, I think this was outside the Dáil, wasn't it? Yeah, that's what that looks like. Just to show you that, people kept campaigning through all this. The interagency partnership, again, as we said, the NDST was gone. And this one about collective identity, it's really interesting now. When you talk about task forces, people, what they're talking about is the coordinator and the staff. And we always keep saying, if you're in the HSE, you're a member of your task force, the agencies are, but it's kind of not seen that way anymore. And as I was saying, the collective decision making and collective accountability, that really is not in place anymore. It's not being supported. And it's back to the norm, which is the decisions are made back in the agencies. And sometimes they're reported to the task forces, sometimes not. And the practical examples of that happening, like these are just a few practical examples. There was dormant accounts funding, was 2 years ago, and there was €42,000, I think, for each task force, which was, people were delighted about it because there had been cuts for 7 years. It's not a large amount of money, but again, like a few years back, the 42,000, the task force would have been given that, and it would be a case of you decide in the local area what's your priority. Now, obviously, there'd be lots of disagreement coming, but at least, it'd be sense if you decide in your area what's priority. And that didn't happen. It was decided in the department that it would be used for, I think, mobilisation around alcohol campaigns was the. Now, nobody's saying there's anything wrong with that, but the point about it is it's how the decision was made and where the decision was made. The Department of Social Protection, they withdrew unilaterally from the local task forces, even though the projects that they fund are a core part of delivering services. The Young People's Facilities Fund was just taken back into the Department of Children, and nobody involved in the drug strategy had any say, and we objected strongly to that, but it didn't make any difference. And just something that's happening at the moment too in some of the other local drug task forces, there are coordinators being recruited at the moment. It's a striking contrast to here in Clondalkin, because that process is being run by the HSE without any real reference to the task forces, which again is going totally against what's been policy up to now and what's been written in the handbook. So it's just these things have real implications for what's happening on the ground. Oh, this is the one you're in, Noreen. Where's Noreen? I told her earlier I'd found a photo. See Noreen there at the bottom? In the middle of community response. Isn't it lovely? You could always rely on Noreen to turn up for the protest, couldn't you? Yeah, and finally then what's changed around the link between the national and the local, well, there isn't any joint membership anymore between the national committees and the local structures. And the relationship between the national and local, it's really narrowed down to being just about funding and governance. It isn't about the broader issues anymore. And governance, I think, is one of those. But governance, I think, is experienced on the ground in the community and by projects as something it's limiting and controlling the work. It's not like good governance. In my view, good governance is governance that supports you to do your work. So if we're all here to deliver an interagency approach to the local drug problem, good governance helps me to do that. The governance we have doesn't help us. And for a long time, we've been actually, this goes back to the NDST days, it's so long, there's been proposals about having a multi-agency funding mechanism. So if you're getting funding from 4 different agencies, you don't have to do it, there should be just one. And that has been talked about forever, and it hasn't happened because the agencies don't appear to want it. That would be good governance. That would be good governance if we could get it. And then, in terms of the local link to national, and again, and I'll come back to this because this has very big implications, I think, around the community development stuff. Like there are a couple of years ago, most of the funding that was in the task forces was mainstreamed to the HSE, as you know. So the HSE now, it has 2 separate and distinct roles, which is fine. There didn't be a problem with that. They have a representation role on the task force where they are equal to every other. They are one partner, equal to everybody else with the same responsibilities, roles as everybody else. Part of a collective, and then they also have their funding governance role. So if a project has an SLA with them, they have a role in overseeing that. But what's happening is those 2 roles are becoming very confused. So the role in the governance and the oversight is kind of getting transferred into a structure that actually should be about equality. And I'll come back to that because that's important. So that's okay. I gave you the happy bit, which, as I say, is very important because we do know that the approach we're talking, which is effectively a community development approach to the drug strategy, we know it can work because it did. It did for a while when it was supported. And then we've gone through over the recent years, we've seen how that's sort of not applying anymore. So in terms of the future, as you know, the new drug strategy has been launched. I'm not going to go, there's not time and it's not place to go into detail on it. I mean, there's a couple of very positive things, like the title there, it's a health-led response. I mean, that is very positive to see that kind of a statement, and that alcohol is included in it. Obviously, there's a lot of work to do to implement those, but it's positive to see that. But obviously, from the point of view of the community sector, a major weakness is that link, as was there in 1996, the very clear link between the broader issues, the broader social and economic issues isn't made in the strategy. But I think, again, this is back to, I suppose, the reclaiming idea that we're focusing on today. This language comes from, this is direct quotes from the National Drug Strategy. So even though it's not clearly making that link, there is stuff in it. I mean, read some of that, the bottom there, enabling communities to participate in shaping the decisions that affect them, opportunities for meaningful engagement in policy development and decision making. That is community development. So what we need to do is we need to take that and blow it up onto big posters, banners everywhere, and stick it around the place and say that's in the National Drug Strategy. Those words are all, as I say, direct quotes. And I think it is about that, and somebody used the term earlier about how we kind of sit and waiting for things. Like, you could look at the words in the drug strategy and say, well, what exactly do they mean by that? What we've got to say is, what do we mean by it? We're the ones who should be saying, this is what that means in practice. It's in there. So let's start saying what, as we've been talking about this morning, what that means in practice. Again, the thing too, and I think it was really a great thing about the film, and somebody said it, because again, we do have this, because obviously there was a lot of protest over the years, and we do have the sense now it's much more difficult to get people involved in protests because they're worn down, but also the intimidation issue is a big one. And I think we do need to kind of remind ourselves that, you know, we still can do that. It's like, somebody, I think it was Sandra said about the film, it's that thing of at the end of it, everybody was standing up and saying, yeah, you know, there was the bit where they're kind of feeling, okay. But by the end of it, they were kind of saying, hang on, no, you know, I can still object to this, I can still have a voice. And I think that the absolute key for us now is that we need to reclaim kind of the strength of our networks. Because I think what's happened as a result of policy is that in policy now there's a distinction between service delivery and community development, because one is funded, the other isn't. So one is kind of legitimate now, and the other one is not funded anymore. And that's kind of led to a divide between those two. And particularly we see it because I referred earlier to the HSE and the governance stuff. And we are starting to get messages which they're dividing kind of community reps and community projects, because this idea is starting to come through, well, if you're involved in a project, then you can't be a community rep because that's a conflict. And no, it isn't. No, it isn't. Like, most people who are active in their communities will end up in some way involved in a project. That's the nature of it. They're activists. So they are the kind of people who are likely to come forward as community reps. They're two separate roles. It's like I said about the HSC. Yes, they are two separate roles, but you have very clear ways of dealing with that through conflict of interest. And that was absolutely crucial that we claim back. So the policies, if you like, are making that division. And what we have to do is completely reject that division and say our community networks, they're made up of community residents, because there is a divide being made between residents. It's made up of community residents, people involved in community projects, family support groups, their community networks. Not only are service delivery and community development not separate, they're actually inextricably, I love that word, inextricably linked, because the work that's done by projects in our communities, it could be done if they didn't take a community development approach. So if you take a drugs project, they don't just look at a person and say, well, you have a problem with your drug use, we'll deal with that. Every project on the ground deals with whatever is thrown at them. If it's a housing issue, if it's a family issue, it's whatever it is, they deal with it. And as well too, a lot of them, you could see it at launch, the Stigma campaign, a lot of the projects are doing incredible community development work, because people coming through those projects are coming out and they are speaking out and they're finding their voice and they're talking about what's going on in their areas. So it's really important that we reclaim that link and don't kind of, follow down that road that's kind of been made at policy level of dividing those things. Yeah, and these are just, again, pictures, because, again, it's like these are videos, but these were made through the network of community projects, and this was an event where all of the projects come together. That's RAID. People will have seen their performances. But, again, it's about emphasising the strength of the resources that we do have there. And building on that strength again, because it is really like what you said at the end of the film. And again, yes, protest. We can still protest. That still is part of community development. And we should still see protest as part of what we do. You're not in that one, Noreen. Couldn't find you in that one. So just to go back to the last slide before I went into the pictures, yeah. So again, basically, I suppose this, and I know it's so we need to strengthen our own networks, and then I know it's a bit of a cliche to say, tell your own story, but it is about setting the framework. It is about what we're saying there, being very clear that community development, what we're talking about, is what the National Drug Strategy is about, and that we tell the story that way, instead of trying to work out what are other people's version and how do we adapt to that. We have to be much clearer in saying this is what we're talking about. That media contacts, that's just a discussion and some people were having around media contacts when, as happens when people are killed, that you get media contacts wanting to talk to people involved in the area about a gangland feud. And there's a group of people just speaking to each other said, we are not going to do that stuff. If any journalist asks us to come on and speak in the context of a gangland feud, we are not going to talk about the deaths of young men anymore in that context. We've got to change that context. We've got to talk about it in a way that makes sense for us. We can't stop talking to the media, but we've got to come on with our own message and say we're not talking about it that way because it's not about a gangland feud. It's about why aren't you asking the question, or why are young men dying and being shot dead? Ask the question and let's hear what we have to say about that. And then obviously the strengthening the networks, but I think it's really key, and I was just saying to Graham, it's great that he's coming on after me because I'm kind of setting the questions and he's going to give the answers to them, which is great. I don't have to. But we really do have to, and it's really important to have this focus that we do have to start developing our own kind of evaluation and assessment tools, because we all know that the ones that we have to use at the moment aren't capturing any of this community development stuff, and what's not captured is not valued. And it's really interesting too, at the very start of the development of new strategy, there were researchers from, I think it was John Moore University in Liverpool, asked to do a bit of work summarising the evidence. And they said they couldn't present any evidence around the community-based projects, but they were really clear, they were very strong. They said, we're not saying that they're not really valuable. What we're saying is there's no existing kind of evaluations that capture what they do. Everything is just about one kind of, and they were saying it's really important that we develop those as kind of people involved in that. And then our own outcome indicators. Yeah, again, there's big pressure on to have outcome indicators, but they have to be ones that are real and that reflect, I suppose, everything that we've been talking about. And in 2006, I think the NACD had done some research on community indicators, which is well worth going back to. So I think, I think I'm at the end now. You don't have to see the photos again because you saw them already. So again, I do think it's, as I say, I think it's just really important that we're here and that we're talking about these issues. I think we do have an opportunity, and I think, there is a huge, very strong network of people there, and hopefully we will be able to, we will. I'm not going to say hopefully we will. We will. Decisive. Okay, thank you very much.